Why do some Christian men look at a woman when she walks by?
And I don't mean to greet her, and I mean that look that lasts 1 second longer than it should.
In this video, I don't want to justify that impulse, but to expose it.
Because this struggle is real, silent, and many don't dare to speak about it. It's not a lack of faith, it's a battle between what the flesh feels and what the spirit demands. 1. Because the sinful nature still dwells in man. Even though a man is born again, the flesh doesn't become holy overnight. Within every Christian still lives that old inclination. That inner voice that seeks pleasure before purity.
In Romans 7:23 it says, I see another law at work in me, waging war against the law of my mind.
Paul wasn't speaking about an unbeliever. He was talking about a man filled with the Spirit, yet still human. This struggle doesn't disappear with the years. It must be controlled, disciplined, and surrendered to the cross daily. That's why feeling temptation isn't hypocrisy. It's evidence of an active battle. The problem isn't that desire exists, but that the heart refuses to surrender it. The Christian man who doesn't recognize his own weakness is 1 step away from falling. In Galatians 5:17, it says that the flesh desires what is contrary to the Spirit. That tension is constant between what the eyes want and what the soul knows it shouldn't have. Only those who live crucifying their sinful nature can truly walk in freedom. 2. Because we live in a hypersexualized world. Today, you don't need to go looking for sin. Sin looks for man on every screen. Social media, music, advertisements, and even casual conversations are saturated with innuendo. Everything is designed to capture attention, to awaken curiosity, to turn what is visual into desire. In 1 John 2:16 it says that everything in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, comes not from the Father. That's the reality. We live in a culture that uses the eyes as gateways to temptation. A Christian cannot control what appears before him, but he can decide how much he lets in. Seeing isn't always sin, but feeding what you saw is. Every second of attention is a seed the enemy can use to distort the mind. That's why Proverbs 4:23 warns, above all else, guard your heart. In a world that sells bodies and trivializes the soul, visual purity has become an act of spiritual warfare. 3. Because the eyes are the gate to the soul. Jesus said it with a clarity that leaves no room for excuses. Anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. In Matthew 5:28, he didn't condemn the glance, but the intention behind it. Eyes don't just observe, they feed.
What you gaze upon with desire eventually shapes what you imagine.
And what you imagine ends up governing your actions. That's why visual sin is so dangerous.
It begins with an innocent look and ends with a captive mind.
The problem isn't having eyes, it's lacking control over them.
The eyes are spiritual gates.
What enters through them will eventually reflect in the soul. In Lamentations 3:51 it says,
My eyes bring pain to my soul because of all the daughters of my city. The enemy knows this. That's why he attacks the visual before the spiritual.
Whoever doesn't protect his gaze will end up contaminating his heart.
Purity begins with what you look at, not just what you avoid. If this message is confronting you, brother, subscribe to Faith Unmasked and share what battle you're facing today.
4. Because the devil knows his weakness.
Satan doesn't need to invent new traps. It's enough for him to repeat the ones that have always worked.
He observes, studies, and strikes where it hurts the most.
What once was a fall, he now uses as a point of entry. In Ephesians 6:11 it says, "Put on the full armor of God, so that you can stand against the schemes of the devil." The enemy doesn't tire, and every careless glance gives him more information about the cracks in the soul. He doesn't attack at random. He attacks with surgical precision. The devil knows that a single image can ignite an internal war.
He knows that a Christian man can resist many things, but not always a visual provocation.
He doesn't need to knock you down instantly. It's enough to distract you slowly. That's why 1 Peter 5:8 warns that he roams like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. The look is his hook, guilt is his chain. And if he isn't faced with discernment and prayer, the animal turns sight into a disguised fall.
5. Because of the lack of self-control.
Many men pray not to fall, but few prepare to resist. Prayer without discipline is like a sword without a blade.
It looks powerful, but it cuts nothing.
In Proverbs 25 verse 28 it says, "Like a city whose walls are broken through is a man who lacks self-control." Self-control isn't requested in a moment of temptation. It's built during days of obedience. If there are no habits that strengthen the spirit, the flesh will take control at the first sign of weakness. The man who doesn't learn to say no in the small things won't be able to do so in the big ones either. Self-control is a fruit of the Spirit, but also a daily decision. It's about setting boundaries before sin breaks them. In Titus 2:12 it says that grace teaches us to renounce worldly desires and to live soberly, righteously, and godly. Without self-control,
Any glance can become a thought, and any thought
can become a fall.
True strength belongs to the one who governs himself.
6. Because the flesh always seeks to feed and desire.
The flesh is never satisfied. It only learns to disguise its hunger. It may seem calm for a while, but as soon as the spirit weakens, it returns to demand what was once denied.
In Galatians 5:17, it says that the flesh desires what is contrary to the spirit, and the spirit what is contrary to the flesh. That tension doesn't disappear. It must be mastered. The problem is that many try to defeat the flesh by praying,
while still feeding it with what they see, hear, and consume.
Carnal desire doesn't fade. It must be replaced.
When a man stops feeding his spirit, the flesh takes over and seeks to satisfy itself in any way it can. That's why Jesus didn't say, "Watch what you feel," but rather watch and pray so that you will not fall into temptation.
The eye that isn't disciplined becomes a slave to the desire it watches.
The flesh will always find a pretext to justify the forbidden. But the wise man understands that not everything that attracts edifies.
Purity begins with what you look at.
Seven. Because of intrusive thoughts.
The most dangerous battle isn't always fought with what is seen, but with what is remembered.
Sometimes the enemy doesn't need a new temptation. He simply revives an old image stored in the mind.
Those scenes, seemingly forgotten, return when the heart is weakest.
In 2 Corinthians 10:5, it says that we must take every thought captive to the obedience of Christ.
But many Christians don't capture their thoughts. They let them roam freely until they end up ruling their will.
An intrusive thought is a silent arrow.
It enters without permission and wounds without noise.
What begins as a memory turns into a fantasy, and what seems harmless ends up contaminating the soul.
That's why Ephesians 6:16 teaches that, with the shield of faith, we extinguish the flaming darts of the evil one.
It's not only about resisting external temptation, but disarming it in the mind. The man who controls his thoughts defeats temptation before it is born.
The man who controls his thoughts defeats temptation before it is born.
The man who controls his thoughts defeats temptation before it is born.
8. Because they have confused attraction with intention.
Seeing beauty is not a sin. Turning it into desire is. God created man with eyes capable of admiring his creation, not worshiping it.
The problem begins when admiration turns into lust.
When what is appreciated becomes something to possess.
In Matthew 5:28, Jesus made it clear that the sin is not in seeing, but in looking with an impure intent.
Not everything beautiful should be contemplated.
And not every attraction should be fed. Purity doesn't deny reality, it redeems it.
A mature Christian man learns to distinguish between noticing and coveting.
Attraction is human, but intention reveals the heart.
In James 1:14 it says that each one is tempted when by his own desire he is dragged away and enticed.
A look can be a reflection of admiration or the beginning of a fall. The difference lies in spiritual control.
Seeing doesn't always contaminate, but choosing to look in order to desire does destroy.
That's why believers must learn to look with holy purpose, not hidden desire. 9. Because they have neglected intimacy with God. A man without prayer is an easy target. Visual temptation isn't overcome by willpower, but through closeness with the Holy Spirit. In God's presence, the eyes are purified, and desires align with holiness. In James 4:8 it says,
Draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. But many men pray only when they fall, not to avoid falling.
Intimacy with God isn't an occasional refuge. It's a permanent shield.
When the heart drifts away from the altar, the gaze begins to wander.
What once caused conviction now becomes justified. What was once avoided is now tolerated.
the fire of communion is the only thing that keeps inner purity alive. Without prayer, the eyes go dim, and discernment dies.
In Psalm 119, verse 9, it says, "How can a young man keep his way pure?"
By guarding it according to your word. There is no self-control without devotion,
nor visual purity without constant presence.
10. Because they no longer fear sin as before.
The danger isn't always in looking, but in justifying what is looked at.
The modern heart has become insensitive to the weight of sin. What was once called a fall is now labeled a weakness. In Proverbs 8:13 it says, "The fear of the Lord is to hate evil."
but when that fear fades, the soul begins to negotiate with what it once avoided. And every excuse opens a wider door for the enemy. The sin that is tolerated will sooner or later become normalized. The man who loses the fear of God stops guarding himself. He no longer flees from temptation. He lingers to watch it.
And what is watched lightly ends up ruling the heart strongly. In Romans 6:12 it says, "Do not let sin reign." Fearing God isn't about being afraid. It's about being aware of His holiness.
Only those who fear dishonoring Him remain pure. Purity is born from respect, not repression.
Brother, you are not fighting this battle alone. Many men carry the guilt of looking, feeling, and failing in silence.
But I didn't come to justify you. I came to remind you that you can overcome.
God didn't call you to be perfect. He called you to be disciplined.
Reject sin in the name of Jesus Christ and learn to master your gaze.
Don't stand measuring your strength against temptation. Flee from it. As Joseph did when everything invited him to fall.
You are not less of a man for struggling, but you are more of a man when you choose to resist.
Let your eyes learn to see as Christ sees, with purity, with purpose, with respect. True victory isn't in not feeling, but in choosing well what to do with what you feel. If this message spoke to your heart, subscribe to Faith Unmasked and keep growing with me in wisdom, truth, and freedom.
So, there you have it. It's a tough fight, isn't it? But remember, you're not alone in this. The real victory isn't about never stumbling.